You know that moment when you're sitting at your kitchen table, maybe it's a Sunday afternoon, and you're staring at your retirement account statement, and there's this number on the page. Maybe it's $47,000, maybe it's $150,000. And you do that quick mental math thing where you try to figure out if this is enough. Like, is this actually going to work? And then you feel this weird mix of anxiety and denial wash over you. So you fold up the statement, put it back in the drawer, and tell yourself you'll think about it later. Later when you have more time. Later when you're less stressed. Later when the number looks better. Except later never really comes, does it? And that's the thing. My name's Oliver, and I spend way too much time thinking about money, financial psychology, and why some people seem to effortlessly build wealth while others stay stuck in the same patterns for decades, watching their financial futures slip further away while somehow never quite understanding why it's happening. And what I've realized after looking at this problem from every possible angle is that the reason 78% of people never retire comfortably has almost nothing to do with what we're typically told. It's not really about not earning enough, though that's part of it. It's not even primarily about not saving enough, though that's definitely part of it too. The real reason is so much more interesting and honestly kind of disturbing because once you see it, you can't unsee it, and you start noticing it everywhere in your own financial life. Because here's what I'm going to walk you through today: the invisible architecture of financial failure that's been built into the way we think about retirement, the way we've been taught to plan for our future, and the quiet psychological traps that keep people perpetually 5 to 10 years behind where they need to be. And I promise you, by the end of this, you're going to look at your own retirement planning completely differently. Not in a scary way, well, maybe a little scary at first, but in a way that actually gives you power to change the trajectory you're on. So let's talk about why most people are heading toward a retirement that looks nothing like what they imagined. Here's something that drives me crazy. We've created this entire cultural narrative around retirement that's basically a fairy tale, but we treat it like it's a realistic plan. You know the story. Work for 30 or 40 years, save a little bit along the way, maybe your company matches your 401k contributions, and then at 65, you ride off into the sunset with enough money to live comfortably for another 20 or 30 years. It sounds reasonable, right? It sounds like a plan. Except when you actually do the math, really sit down and calculate what comfortable retirement costs in today's dollars, adjusted for inflation, accounting for healthcare, accounting for the fact that you might live to 95, the numbers are absolutely terrifying. We're talking about needing somewhere between $1.5 and $2.5 million for a middle-class retirement. And the median retirement savings for people approaching retirement age in America right now, it's around $200,000. Let me say that again. The target is $1.5 to $2.5 million. The reality is $200,000. That's not a gap, that's a chasm. That's the Grand Canyon of financial planning. And yet most people don't panic about this. They don't lie awake at night doing the calculations in their head. You know why? Because of something psychologists call temporal discounting. Basically, our brains are really, really bad at caring about future problems. If I told you there was a 78% chance your house would burn down tomorrow, you'd be boarding up windows and calling insurance companies. But if I tell you there's a 78% chance you won't have enough money in 30 years, your brain just sort of shrugs. Future you seems like a different person, and honestly, present day you has bills to pay right now. I saw this with my uncle, actually. Smart guy, worked in IT for decades, made decent money, probably $80,000 to $100,000 a year for most of his career. And he always said he was working on retirement. He'd talk about his 401k, mention that he was contributing the minimum to get the company match. Seems like he had a plan. But he retired at 67, and within about 8 months, it became clear that the money just wasn't there, not even close. He's fine now. He had to go back to work part-time, his kids help out, he downsized his life significantly, but the retirement he imagined, the one he thought he was building toward, it just evaporated when he actually looked at the numbers. And here's the thing that haunts me about his story.
He did what he was supposed to do. He had a 401k, he contributed something every month. He wasn't frivolous with money. He wasn't making $30,000 a year and buying luxury cars. He was doing basically what most financial advice tells you to do, and it still wasn't enough, which means there's something structurally wrong with the advice itself.
Okay, so let's talk about one of the most damaging pieces of financial advice that's been repeated so many times it's basically become gospel. Save 10% of your income for retirement. You've heard this, right? It's everywhere. Financial advisors say it, articles say it, your HR department probably said it when you signed up through your 401k. Just save 10% and you'll be fine. And it sounds reasonable. 10% feels like a meaningful chunk without being overwhelming. It feels achievable. It feels like you're being responsible. Here's the problem. For most people, 10% isn't even remotely enough. Like, it's not close. If you start saving 10% of your income at age 25, work until 65, and get average market returns, you'll end up with maybe 7 to 8 times your final salary saved, which sounds great until you realize that most financial planners recommend having 10 to 12 times your final salary to maintain your standard of living in retirement. So you're short by 25 to 40%, even if everything goes perfectly. And that's assuming you start at 25. Most people don't. The average person doesn't really start seriously saving for retirement until their mid-30s or even early 40s when they finally feel financially stable enough to think beyond next month's bills. If you start at 35 or 40 saving 10%, you're going to end up with maybe 4 to 6 times your final salary, which means you're going to run out of money around age 75 or 80, assuming you retire at 65. But nobody tells you this clearly, or if they do, it's buried in some footnote or presented in a way that makes it sound optional, like consider saving more if possible. Not the 10% rule is fundamentally insufficient and will lead to financial insecurity in your 70s. I think about this a lot, why we keep repeating advice that doesn't actually work. And I think it's because 10% feels comfortable. It doesn't require people to make hard choices or dramatically change their lifestyle. It lets everyone feel like they're doing the right thing without actually confronting the scary reality of what retirement actually costs. It's like telling someone they can run a marathon if they jog once a week. Sure, technically you're exercising, but you're nowhere near prepared for what's coming. The reality, most people probably need to be saving 15 to 20% minimum starting as early as possible, and even that might not be enough if you're starting late or if you have student loans, medical debt, or you're supporting family members. Which leads us to the next problem. Here's something I've noticed about retirement planning. It's been made so incredibly complicated that people just freeze. Like, they know they should be doing something, but the something involves understanding Roth IRAs versus traditional IRAs, 401k contribution limits, tax implications, asset allocation strategies, target date funds, expense ratios, and on until your brain just shuts down and you decide to think about it later. And the financial industry loves this, by the way. Complexity benefits the people selling financial products. It makes you feel like you need expert help, need special knowledge, need someone to manage your money for you, for a fee, of course. Which I'm not saying professional financial advice is bad, but I am saying that the basic principles of retirement saving aren't actually that complicated. We've just allowed them to become complicated because complexity creates an entire ecosystem of middlemen who can extract fees. But here's what complexity really does. It prevents people from starting. I have a friend. She's in her early 40s, works in marketing, makes about $70,000 a year, and she has virtually nothing saved for retirement. Not because she doesn't care, but because every time she tries to research what she should do, she gets overwhelmed. Should she open a Roth IRA? What's the difference between that and her 401k? Should she be investing in index funds or target date funds? What about bonds? And what if she wants to retire early? Doesn't that change everything? So she ends up doing nothing, because doing nothing feels safer than doing the wrong thing. This is what psychologists call choice overload or analysis paralysis.
When you have too many options and too much information, your brain doesn't become more decisive, it becomes less decisive. It's easier to maintain the status quo than to risk making a mistake. And the retirement industry has basically weaponized this, not intentionally, maybe, but the effect is the same. People are drowning in options and information and acronyms, and meanwhile, their most valuable asset, time, is just evaporating while they try to figure out the perfect strategy. The truth is, the perfect strategy is the one you actually implement. Starting is more important than optimizing. Saving something is infinitely better than saving nothing while you research the optimal asset allocation. But we've created a system where people feel like they need a PhD in finance before they're allowed to begin. Okay, this next part is uncomfortable, but we need to talk about it. Lifestyle inflation is absolutely destroying people's ability to retire. Here's how it works. You get your first real job out of college, you're making $35,000 or $40,000, and you're living like a college student. Cheap apartment, used car, cooking most of your meals. You're not saving much, but you're getting by. Then you get a raise, then a promotion, then another job that pays better, and suddenly you're making $60,000, then $75,000, then $90,000. And at each step, you adjust your lifestyle to match your income. You move to a nicer apartment, you buy a new car, you start eating out more, buying nicer clothes, taking better vacations. You upgrade your phone every 2 years instead of every 4. You get a gym membership, a streaming service subscription bundle, maybe a pet that needs veterinary care and premium food. None of these things individually feels extravagant. They all feel reasonable, justified, deserved even. You've worked hard. You've earned a little comfort. And that's the trap, because your income went up, let's say by 40% over 5 years, but your expenses went up by 35%. So yeah, technically you have more left over at the end of the month, but not much more, not change your financial future more, just slightly more. And here's the really insidious part. The things you upgrade to don't feel like luxuries after about 6 months. They feel like necessities. Your brain recalibrates. The nicer apartment becomes your baseline. The new car becomes what you need. And the thought of going backward, of downsizing, of living below your means again, it feels like failure. It feels like you're regressing. I see this everywhere. People making $100,000, $120,000, even $150,000 a year, and they're living paycheck to paycheck. Not because they're irresponsible, they're not buying boats or designer handbags or taking luxury vacations every month. They're just living a lifestyle that consumes almost all of their income, and they genuinely believe they can't save more because their expenses feel necessary. But here's the math that should terrify you. If you're 35 years old and you're making $100,000 a year and you're saving that recommended 10%, $10,000, over 30 years with average returns, you'll have maybe $1.2 million saved, which sounds great until you realize to maintain a $100,000 a year lifestyle in retirement, you need closer to $2.5 million. And if your lifestyle has been inflating every time you get a raise, you might actually need even more than that because you've trained yourself to expect a certain standard of living. The people who retire comfortably aren't usually the people who made the most money. They're the people who kept their lifestyle relatively stable even as their income grew. They're the people who got a $15,000 raise and saved $12,000 of it instead of upgrading their car. They're the people who can live on 60 or 70% of their income and invest the rest. But our entire economy is built on encouraging you to do the opposite. Every advertisement, every social media post, every conversation with friends about their new house or new car, it's all pulling you towards spending more, consuming more, deserving more. Let me tell you about something that doesn't get nearly enough attention in retirement planning. Healthcare costs are going to absolutely devastate people who haven't prepared for them. The average couple retiring today needs approximately $300,000 just for healthcare costs in retirement. That's not long-term care, by the way. That's just regular healthcare. Doctor visits, prescriptions, Medicare premiums, supplemental insurance. $300,000. And most people, they have no idea. They're doing their retirement calculations based on their current expenses, maybe adding a little cushion for inflation, but they're not factoring in that healthcare costs increase faster than general inflation. They're not factoring in that Medicare doesn't cover everything. They're not factoring in that one serious health issue can cost $50,000 to $100,000 even with insurance. I watch my parents deal with this right now. My dad's 71, my mom's 69, they're both retired, and they did a lot of things right financially. They saved, they invested, they were careful. But healthcare costs are eating through their savings faster than they anticipated. My dad's on medication that costs $400 a month, even with Medicare. My mom needed a surgery last year that cost them $12,000 out of pocket after insurance. They're fine, they planned for some of this, but even they're shocked by how expensive everything is. And they're the lucky ones. They're relatively healthy. They have savings, they have decent supplemental insurance. But what about the 78% who don't have adequate savings? What happens when they get sick? This is the thing that keeps me up at night when I think about the retirement crisis. It's not just that people won't have enough money for groceries or rent, it's that they won't have enough money for the medications that keep them alive. They'll be choosing between prescriptions and food, between doctor visits and electricity bills. And honestly, this is where the whole save 10% of your income advice reveals itself as borderline cruel. Because if you save 10% and end up with $400,000 or $500,000 in retirement, and then healthcare costs eat up $300,000 of that, you're left with basically nothing for the last 10 or 15 years of your life. The people who retire comfortably are the ones who specifically planned for healthcare as a separate, massive expense category. They maximized health savings accounts. They calculated the real cost of Medicare plus supplemental insurance. They built in a cushion for the inevitable medical issues that come with aging. But most people don't do this because, again, it's uncomfortable to think about. It's easier to imagine a retirement where you're healthy and active and only occasionally need to see a doctor. Nobody wants to plan for the version where you're managing multiple chronic conditions and spending hours each week at various medical appointments.
Here's something that doesn't get emphasized enough. Inflation is going to erode your retirement savings in ways that are really hard to visualize when you're 30 or 40 or even 50 years old. Let me give you an example. Let's say you're 35 right now, and you've calculated that you need $50,000 a year to live comfortably today. Okay, great. So you do the math and figure you need about $1.25 million saved to generate $50,000 a year in retirement, using the 4% rule. Seems doable, maybe, but here's what people forget. You're not retiring today. You're retiring in 30 years. And in 30 years, with just 3% annual inflation, which is actually pretty conservative, that $50,000 you need will actually need to be $121,000 to buy the same stuff, which means you don't need $1.25 million. You need closer to $3 million. $3 million. And suddenly the whole thing feels impossible, right? Like, how is a normal person making $60,000 or $80,000 or even $100,000 a year supposed to save $3 million? It feels absurd. It feels like the system is rigged. And you know what? It kind of is, because wages haven't kept pace with inflation or productivity for decades. Housing costs have exploded, education costs have exploded, healthcare costs have exploded, but salaries have just sort of stayed relatively flat when adjusted for inflation. So you've got this situation where retirement costs are increasing faster than people's ability to save for retirement. And the people who end up okay are either the ones who got lucky with timing, bought a house before prices went crazy, got into a high-paying field early, or the ones who are extremely disciplined about saving 20% or 25% or 30% of their income despite all the pressures to spend more. But here's what kills me. We've known about this problem for years. Decades, really, and instead of addressing the structural issues, stagnant wages, increasing costs, inadequate retirement systems, we just keep telling individuals to save more, as if willpower and personal responsibility can overcome systemic economic forces.
I'm not saying personal responsibility doesn't matter. It absolutely does. You have to save, you have to plan, you have to make smart financial decisions. But we also need to be honest that the game has gotten significantly harder over the last 40 or 50 years, and pretending it hasn't is just gaslighting an entire generation of workers who are doing everything they're supposed to do and still falling short.
Let's talk about Social Security for a minute. Because there's this widespread assumption that Social Security will be there to catch you if your retirement savings fall short. And look, Social Security will probably exist in some form. It's political suicide to eliminate it. But the Social Security Administration itself has been warning for years that the trust fund is going to be depleted by sometime in the 2030s, which means benefits might be cut by 20% or 25% or more unless Congress acts. And given the current political climate, I'm not holding my breath for a comprehensive fix. But even if Social Security stays exactly as it is, here's what people don't understand. Social Security was never designed to be your primary retirement income. It was designed as a safety net, a supplement to your pension and personal savings. The average Social Security benefit right now is about $1,800 a month. That's $21,600 a year. You can't live on that, not comfortably. Maybe you can survive if you've paid off your mortgage, if you have no debt, if you stay healthy, but comfortable? No. And yet, I can't tell you how many people I've talked to who are basically counting on Social Security as their retirement plan. They'll say things like, well, I'll get Social Security and I've got a little saved, so I should be okay. And when you actually do the math, it's not okay, not even close. This is another form of that temporal discounting thing we talked about earlier. Social Security feels like this guaranteed thing that's going to save you so you don't have to fully confront the inadequacy of your savings right now. It's a psychological comfort blanket that prevents people from feeling the appropriate level of urgency about their situation. The people who retire comfortably treat Social Security as a bonus, not as the foundation. They save as if Social Security won't exist, and then if it does exist when they retire, great. It's extra cushion, extra flexibility, extra security, but their core retirement plan doesn't depend on it. Here's something that's mathematically brutal but really important to understand. Starting late with retirement savings doesn't just mean you have less time to save. It means you lose the entire power of compound growth, which is basically the only thing that makes comfortable retirement achievable for most people. Let me show you what I mean with some numbers. If you start saving $500 a month at age 25, by age 65, with average returns, you'll have roughly $1.4 million. But if you wait until 35 to start saving that same $500 a month, you'll end up with only about $680,000. You waited 10 years, but you lost more than half the final amount. That's not a typo. Starting 10 years later cuts your retirement savings by more than 50%, even though you're only missing 10 years of contributions, which is about $60,000 in total contributions. Those $60,000 in contributions would have turned into $720,000 in growth. That's the power of compounding, and it's why starting late is so devastating. And this is why so many people hit their 50s and suddenly panic, because they look at their retirement accounts, maybe they've got $100,000 or $150,000 saved, and they do the math and realize they need to be at $500,000 or $700,000 by now to be on track. And there's just no way to make up that gap with normal savings. You'd need to be putting away $3,000 or $4,000 a month to catch up, which is more than most people's rent or mortgage. So they either go into denial, it'll work out somehow, or they adjust their expectations. I guess I'll work longer, or I'll downsize, or maybe I don't need to retire comfortably. And those adjustments are basically admitting defeat, admitting that the retirement they imagined isn't going to happen. I think about this with people in their 30s and 40s who still aren't seriously saving, and I want to just shake them and say every year you wait costs you exponentially more.
But you can't say that without sounding like a self-righteous personal finance nerd, so mostly I just watch people sleepwalk toward a really difficult future.
Okay, so if all of this sounds depressing, I promise we're going to end on a more constructive note. Because there are people who retire comfortably who aren't in that 78%. And they're not all high earners or trust fund kids or lottery winners. Some of them are just people who figured out the actual principles that work. Here's what they do differently. First, they start as early as humanly possible. Even if it's just $50 or $100 a month, they start because they understand that time in the market is more valuable than timing the market or waiting until they can contribute more. Second, they automate everything. They set up automatic transfers from checking to investment accounts on payday, so the money never sits in their checking account tempting them. They automate their 401k contributions. They automate their IRA contributions. They remove willpower from the equation because they understand that willpower fails when you're tired or stressed or you see something you want to buy. Third, they keep their lifestyle relatively stable as their income grows. This is probably the hardest one and the most important. When they get a raise, they save most of it. When they get a bonus, they invest it. They resist the pull of lifestyle inflation by consciously choosing to live below their means. Fourth, they actually do the math. They sit down maybe once a year and calculate where they are versus where they need to be. They use retirement calculators. They adjust their contributions if they're falling behind. They don't just hope it'll work out, they verify it's working out. Fifth, they diversify their tax situation. They use Roth accounts for some savings and traditional pre-tax accounts for others, so they have flexibility in retirement to manage their tax burden. They max out health savings accounts if they're eligible because it's basically a superpowered retirement account for healthcare costs. And sixth, this one's subtle but important. They educate themselves enough to be confident in their strategy, but they don't let perfect be the enemy of good. They pick a reasonable approach, usually something simple like low-cost index funds and a target date retirement fund, and they stick with it. They don't panic during market downturns, they don't chase hot stocks, they don't constantly tinker with their allocation, they just stay the course. None of this is sexy, none of it is exciting. It's just boring, consistent, patient discipline over decades. But that's the secret, I think. The people who retire comfortably aren't doing anything magical. They're just doing simple things consistently for a very long time. So let me come back to the title of this whole thing. The real reason 78% of people never retire comfortably. It's not just one reason. It's not just that they don't save enough or they start too late or healthcare costs surprise them. It's all of these things compounding together, reinforcing each other. But if I had to point to the single most fundamental issue, it's this. We've built a retirement system that requires individual discipline, long-term thinking, and financial literacy to navigate successfully. But we've done almost nothing as a society to cultivate those qualities or make that navigation easier. We've essentially said, you're on your own, good luck, and then acted surprised when most people struggle. The people in the 22% who do retire comfortably, they've usually had some combination of advantages. They learned about money early, or they had parents who taught them, or they stumbled into good financial advice, or they naturally have the personality traits that make long-term delayed gratification easier, or they got lucky with their career timing and earned more during their prime saving years. But for most people, they're getting conflicting advice, they're overwhelmed by complexity, they're fighting against lifestyle inflation, they're dealing with stagnant wages and rising costs, and they're carrying this vague sense that they should be doing something about retirement, but they're not quite sure what, so they just drift. And years become decades, and suddenly they're 60 years old and nowhere near ready. And that's heartbreaking to me. Because these aren't lazy people or irresponsible people. They're just people who didn't have the right information at the right time, or who did have the information but couldn't quite operationalize it in their actual lives. So here's what I want you to take away from this. If you're young, in your 20s or early 30s, you have the most valuable asset possible, time. Use it. Start saving something,
anything today. Not next month, not after you pay off that one credit card, not when you get a raise. Today. Even if it's $25 a month. Because every month you wait costs you exponentially more in the long run. If you're in your 30s or 40s and you haven't been saving enough, it's not too late. It's harder, yes, you'll need to save a higher percentage of your income. You'll need to be more aggressive about controlling lifestyle inflation. But it's still possible to build a comfortable retirement if you start now and you're serious about it. And if you're in your 50s or 60s and you're behind, you need to get very real very quickly about your situation. Run the numbers. Talk to a financial advisor. Figure out if you need to work longer or downsize or relocate to a lower cost of living area or some combination of all three. Because hoping it'll work out is not a strategy. But more than anything, I want you to understand that if you're struggling with this, you're not alone. 78% of people aren't failing because they're broken or stupid or lazy. They're failing because the system is hard and the advice is often inadequate, and we've made retirement planning far more complicated than it needs to be. You deserve to retire comfortably. You deserve to not spend your 70s and 80s worrying about money. And achieving that is possible, but it requires you to opt out of the default path that most people are on. It requires you to be intentional, to be patient, to be disciplined in ways that our consumer culture actively discourages. It requires you to start thinking of your future self not as some abstract concept, but as a real person you're going to meet one day. A person who's going to inherit all the financial decisions you're making right now. And when you meet that person, when you are that person, you're going to be so grateful that you started taking this seriously today. Not tomorrow, not next year, today. Because that's the only real secret. The only way to beat the statistics and end up in the 22% instead of the 78%. You start, and then you keep going, year after year, even when it's boring, even when it's hard, even when that new car or that nicer apartment is calling your name. You just keep going.